Thanks for being called, Louise. You're the next caller, but let's speak to the other person who really is dominating the news at the moment concerning the autumn statement, which is the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, who I'm pleased to say joins me now. Thank you for coming on, Shadow Chancellor. So let me give you some of the headlines. The biggest tax cuts since the 1980s, state pension up by 8.5%, £11 billion tax breaks for business, 27 million of us to save an average of £450 on NI a year, and all duty frozen on our Christmas party booze. Which one of those would Labour change? Good morning.
Good morning, great to talk to you. You forgot the Mirror headline, which I think it says, "Who are you kidding?"
Well done. And it says, do they take us, virtually there, do they take us all for fools? Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'll come back to the other one. Really. So state pension, £11 billion tax breaks, 27 million saving. Which one of those would they change, Rachel Reeves?
Well, look, I'm in favour, as you know, Nick, in giving British families a bit of a break after all the tax hikes we've had these last few years. So Labour will be supporting the cut to national insurance and the money to uprate pensions and benefits. But there are things that we would have done yesterday to get our economy growing, to get money into our National Health Service that the government chose not to do.
Outline some of those, if you would, Shadow Chancellor.
Yes, of course. So, for example, the growth forecasts yesterday from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility shows that growth is downgraded next year, the year after, and the year after that. I have put forward a serious and comprehensive plan for growth backed by business, to reform our planning system to get Britain building again, to reform our pension system so that we can get more money to the start-up and scale-up businesses that will power our economy, and creating a national wealth fund to invest in alongside business in the industries and the jobs and the opportunities of the future, because we have got to get out of this doom loop of low growth that our economy has experienced these last 13 years.
But if the Chancellor were listening, surely he would say, Rachel, that's what £11 billion worth of tax breaks, the largest boost in modern years, that's what that's all about, is how he might respond.
But look at the verdicts of the Office for Budget Responsibility, who haven't upgraded growth, they've downgraded it for each of the next 3 years. And we have languished these last 13 years in the bottom third of the league table for growth amongst the most industrialised economies. That is a poor record, and the impact of that record is that working people are worse off and our public services are on their knees. That is why the number one mission of an incoming Labour government, if we have that privilege next year, is to grow our economy.
Well, let's talk about that, and I know you're taking nothing for granted, but it could be that it will be you delivering budgets and autumn statements in the future, and you'll have to contend with the Chancellor pencilling in £19 billion worth of cuts to public services over budgets of 5 years. Will you stick to those, or if you want to reverse them, where would the money come from?
Well, I'm under no illusions about the scale of the challenge that I would inherit if I become Chancellor next year. But I would have, if it had been my autumn statement yesterday, put more money into our frontline public services, specifically our schools and our hospitals. I would have got rid of the non-dom tax status and replaced it with a system for people who are genuinely in the UK for short periods of time, and used that money to create an additional 2 million appointments a year in our NHS to reduce this backlog of operations and scans and appointments of 7.8 million people now, and also use that money to create breakfast clubs at all of our primary schools to help young people get the best start in life, and also help their mums and dads be able to work more hours or travel a little bit further to work every day, so that they've got more money in their family bank accounts.
You're nothing if not a canny politician. The relief of NI, brought in January, when many would have thought it would be brought in for the next tax year. Does that to you speak of an early election? A, does it, and B, are Labour ready to go if it is?
Well, I think they're obviously keeping that option open, and I say bring it on. Since the last election, we've had 3 prime ministers, 5 chancellors of the Exchequer, and the economy goes from bad to worse. The Resolution Foundation this morning have said this is the first parliament ever where living standards at the end of it are going to be worse than at the beginning. Britain needs change. People are worse off under the Conservatives,
Rachel,
and Labour have got a plan to make families better off.
But back to my point. point, how surprised are you that that's being brought on? The relief is as of January, not as of the fresh tax year. How surprised were you by that?
Well, I'm pleased because working families need some relief, but the tax cuts yesterday don't remotely compensate for the tax increases that people have had to endure these last 4 years, and the tax burden is now at a 75-year high and is going to increase under Conservative plans for each of the next 5 years. I don't want to carry on like that. I want working people to have more of their money in their pockets, especially during a cost of living crisis, and that's why my focus is on growing the economy to be able to achieve just that.
So that's on the personal side. On the business side, would Labour seek to keep the business tax cuts that Mr Hunt introduced as well?
Well, I've been arguing for those, the full expensing of business investment, because business investment has fallen. It is behind other similar economies, and business investment is the lifeblood of a successful economy, and I want to see more of it.
Okay, the idea also that we have this benefits crackdown, how concerned are you? We've been to your constituency, by the way. We spoke with one poor person who was made homeless after the death of his mother. He spent some nights sleeping on her grave because he's got nowhere to go. How concerned are you this crackdown? There could be some people who just fall through, some people who have genuine cases that are not properly heard.
Well, let me just say, for anybody in Leeds experiencing that sort of destitution, we are very lucky to have a wonderful charity called St George's Crypt in the centre of Leeds that does have emergency accommodation for people that need it. And I can't recommend the services and the difference that they make in transforming people's lives enough. And I know that there is very real need, not just in my own constituency of Leeds West, but around the country. I also strongly believe that people who can work should work, and the benefit system has always been there as a safety net for people, but there's always been conditions attached to receiving that support. And we've got at the moment something like 2.6 million people who are off work, long-term sick, and at the same time, a number I just used a few moments ago, we've got 7.8 million on hospital waiting lists. We need to reduce those numbers who have got their lives on hold because they're waiting for hospital operations and appointments, and that is the surest way to get people back to work.
Final point, you won't have been listening when I interviewed the Chancellor earlier, but my first question was, had he bought his wife a birthday gift, and what was it, as he referenced at the start of his speech? Rachel, can you believe, not only did he not get his wife a gift yesterday, he hasn't even sent her a card. How would you respond if the person in your life forgot a gift or a card on your birthday? I don't imagine it would ever come from Jeremy Hunt, but how would you... Rachel Reeves.
If my husband is listening this morning, Nick, and I think he's just dropped the kids at school, my birthday is on the 13th of February, don't forget it.
The day before Valentine's Day, how appropriate. Rachel Reeves, thank you. Shadow Chancellor and Labour MP appearing here, of course, on LBC 2 minutes before she actually put her hand to her mouth when I told her that the Chancellor. Like a moment. Mr Hunt, you might agree with that. Louise in Citybourne in Kent. Let's talk about the reality of this benefits crackdown. What does it mean to you, Louise? Good morning.
It could mean an awful lot, as I'm already living on the breadline as it is. We are on the old system, and you forgive me, I'm having quite a bad day today.
Okay.
I have a condition.
Take your time.
Called fibromyalgia.
Yes.
It's very hard to diagnose, and it took the best part of 2 years. My younger sister has it, and I'm 53.
Right.
But it took 6 years for
Just
her to get a
explain what it means
diagnosis.
to someone who's got it. Of course, it makes it very painful.
Fibromyalgia is very, very painful. It's about having different pains all over your body, but it can affect you. For instance, people can suffer from severe diabetes and everything. It can bring on other conditions, but the pain is always there. You have it in different parts of your body. And today, I suffer in particular from a tremor,
Right.
and when I get going like this,
Yes.
now you can hear. So I can't stand for very long. This has happened really over the last 3 months. I've deteriorated really quickly. The last 4 weeks I've deteriorated, and I saw my doctor. And
What's your concern from yesterday, Louise?
but my concern from yesterday is I'm going to move over to the old system, to the new system, to universal credit. I'm on the old.
I see.
So I get I have help with my rent, and my partner is older than me, so he's retired, so we have a little bit of a pension from him.
Yeah.
But we do rely on the state. I'm very grateful, by the way. I'm very grateful. But Universal Credit seems to, they're not going to help me anymore. We've worked out through their page that you can go on that we're going to have less money.
How much do you know yet? Exactly what it might mean, Louise?
I don't know exactly what I'm going to get, but it works out. We reckon between £150 and £200 less.
What? A month?
A month, yes. Yeah.
What's the impact of that?
The impact of that, to be honest with you, I don't know how what I should pay first, right? My rent, my heating bills, or buying food for me, my partner, my 7-year-old grandson, who I have legal guardianship of, and my son. And my son is 19 and works full time. He does pay keep, and he helps out with shopping.
Yeah.
But I am 53, and I feel, as just a decent human being, that I would like, if I could, to work. But I don't need to be penalised because I have a condition that you can't see. Because if you looked at me, and I wasn't, my legs weren't shaking, because I do have aid with a stick now,
right,
that you wouldn't know that I was ill. But once even putting a card up against the card reader when you're shopping,
it's difficult.
My hand just go, you just go, whoa.
I've heard it in your voice that you're having those issues. Louise, let us know how it goes when you move from the old system into the new system. Do please stay in touch and let us know if the reality is you take that kind of hit to the income for your home. Louise, I have to move now, but good luck. Please let us know what it means to you. It's 9:01. Let's get some LBC headlines.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC. From Global's newsroom, the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves has told Nick that people can't carry on with a rising tax burden. She says yesterday's national insurance reduction doesn't remotely compensate for changes made over the last 5 years. The cut will come into force in January, but Jeremy Hunt has played down suggestions of any link with a possible spring election. Ms Reeves says Labour would welcome that.
I say bring it on. Since the last election, we've had 3 prime ministers, 5 chancellors of the Exchequer, and the economy goes from bad to worse. The Resolution Foundation this morning have said this is the first parliament ever where living standards at the end of it are going to be worse than at the beginning. Britain needs change. People are worse off under the Conservatives.
The energy regulator Ofgem has confirmed its price cap will rise by £94 a year from January. It says the change has been driven almost entirely by market instability and the ongoing war in Ukraine. The Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron has arrived in Israel for talks on the situation in Gaza. A hostage release agreement between Israel and Hamas had been due to take effect earlier this morning. Israeli officials have suggested the 4-day truce will now start tomorrow. The FA has reportedly completed a review of the lighting of Wembley's arch in support of countries or causes. It's understood the practice will now stop altogether after the FA refused to display the colours of the Israeli flag last month. Right-wing leader Geert Wilders' party has won the most seats in the Dutch general election. He will now seek to form a coalition with his Freedom Party set to win 37 of 150 seats in Parliament. Dutch journalist Robin Pascoe has been following the campaign. She's told Nick that most parties don't want Mr Wilders to become Prime Minister.
There's an awful lot of moving going to have to happen in the next few days. I mean, they are talking already about it, and candidates are trying to get answers from the leaders of these 2 parties which are likely to join them. But so far there's no movement. They'll have to bring in an elder statesman to sort of sort it out, I think.
In the city a short time ago, the FTSE 100 was up 10 points at 74.80. The pound buys $1.25 and €1.14. LBC weather, cloudy with patchy rain for many, blustery showers further north, a high of 13 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Thomas Watts.
Safe driving when you're on the North Circular, Nigel, thank you. Also, of course, I remind you, we're moving towards the end of post-autumn statement coverage. I sense some of the questions will be about benefits. What makes me think that? because of the huge number of calls that we've taken and emails and texts and tweets. So if you've got a specific question, what am I going to do about my PIP? What am I going to do about this? What am I going to do about losing my allowance or whatever if I'm unable to find work or I don't take a work placement or whatever it might be? But more broadly, we can continue to take the conversation forward on that. Michael is in Asker. Well, now, where's that in Norway then? I don't know Norway very well. Whereabouts in Norway are you? Good morning.
Good morning. It's halfway between the city of Drammen and the fine city of Oslo.
Hardebra. What are you going to... Good morning. What are you going to... sorry, that is good morning. What are you going to say about benefits then, Michael, sitting where you are in Norway?
Sure. What I wanted to say is in previous experience before I retired, we used to help disabled people into work, and if the government, which they said they do, they want to get thousands of people back into work, then you need an infrastructure to deal with that. It's not just going to happen. You're going to need a lot of people to help people with disabilities and health problems back into work, or many into work for the first time. So you're going to need an infrastructure, but the government don't seem to be talking about that at all.
What should they be, in your view, what should they be talking about then, Michael?
Well, they need to look at the realities, and the reality is that people with disabilities that haven't worked for a long time, and I know that many of your callers they'd like to get back to work, they've got to be helped, and in fairness, the employers have to be helped also. So there has to be an investment of an infrastructure to put significant numbers of disabled people back into work, or to support them back into work. It is not an easy process. It is not an easy process, but it can be done. But you can't do it on the cheap. You know, there's a lot of things that's been dismantled. You know, the wage subsidy was gone. It was, I think, Gordon Brown was the guy that got rid of that, and yeah, so it's not cheap, it's not easy, it can be done, but only with support and a decent support infrastructure.
What's taken you to Asker?
My partner, she's Norwegian. So
okay. What's the big, where are you from? I'm assuming you're probably from Scotland, or you were born in Scotland?
I'm from Dundee, on the east coast of Scotland.
What's the biggest change in life from Dundee on the east coast of Scotland to Asker, 40 miles west of Oslo?
The obvious one I would say is the price of a pint, but if I wanted to be less flippant about it, I would say how tidy and respectful people are here.
But more importantly, what's the price of a pint?
Well, because the exchange rate favours Scotland at the moment, it's about £7.50 generally for a pint.
In Norway?
Yeah, in Norway.
Sorry, what is a pint in the UK? I don't drink beer. Is it about £6?
A pint in Dundee would be about £4, maybe £5.
Wow, that is a difference. You look after yourself. Have a great life. Thank you in Asker. Mary in Barnet. Mary. Now you used to work in some of this benefit setup. Is that correct? Hello.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
Good morning. So I do contracts for the DWP and KCC, and in terms of welfare work. So they did the roll out the invest credit and in terms of the schemes for getting people with disabilities into work. Now, what's been noticed, we weren't trained to deal with people with disabilities, and majority of staff were not trained at the time. And likewise, right now, and the same thing, that they're going to roll out a scheme to help people with disabilities go into work without right schemes available. So in terms of training disabled people, you don't have someone to assess them in terms of their capabilities. It's all about targets. They've got targets to meet every quarterly to make sure they go into work, so they don't take the boxes. So
what is the, as a member of staff on the front line, as it were, what was the impact of these targets that were set for you and your colleagues?
It's don't mean you will be penalised, and then you have basically regular assessments that we do, and if we have meetings every 3 months, make sure we meet the targets. If we don't, we get in trouble.
Did you enjoy the work, Mary?
I enjoyed it. I actually loved it because I like helping people. Now, the problem is, with the system within the DWP and JCT, they don't have right training. And in terms of hiring staff, they don't go in terms of what the market needs. It's all about retail. If someone's disabled, for example, blind, I had someone who was blind and had one arm. Now, how am I going to get them into work? How can I select a right employee to get them into work? How is that possible?
Sorry to talk over you, I do apologize. It's only because I've got about a minute with you now.
Yeah.
This idea of being fit for work, how fair are the tests that are applied?
It's not. To be honest, it's not. We have people with kidney disease. Now, kidney disease, they go on dialysis at stage 5. they don't assess and they don't have the ability to assess someone or understanding of what the stage 5 kidney disease means. Likewise with the kidney patients, I had to get someone who had cancer, and she was sanctioned 5 times. After a year later, she passed away. Because she was in so much stress, the husband was working a 3 jobs. He couldn't help her, and then he had the constantly penalising them. And we had tried. I never sanctioned anyone. I didn't agree to sanction anyone because, especially if they're a cancer patient or have kidney disease, why should I sanction them?
Mary, thanks for lifting the curtain so much of what went on. Have a good day. A couple of emails on some of the subjects as we get ready, of course, to move the panel into position to take your calls. Andy in the Wirral wants to reflect on our conversation with Rachel Reeves. How big is this non-dom tax loophole? Labour so far are using it to pay for thousands more border force. Emily Thornberry on your show. 2 million new GP appointments. We're streeting on your show. And Rachel Reeves this morning. And breakfast clubs for every child this morning. It doesn't add up. On the subject of Jeremy Hunt, Richard says, what happens to the disabled and sick who fall through the cracks of the Christian was your question. His answer, we would make them better and thus able to work. This was sheer patronising nonsense. And lastly, on the subject of genocide, Graham in Beaconsfield. Genocide is the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group. Is Hamas a particular ethnic group? If it's then, it is genocide. But I don't believe they are, says Graham. They are obviously terrorists who deserve to be finished, but that isn't genocide in my view. All right, keep them coming. And after the news.
I'm Edward Graham from the anti-poverty charity Z2K, and I'll be answering your calls later on.
And I'm financial journalist Paul Lewis, answering your questions later in the show.
The autumn statement has thrown up so many. What will Jeremy Hunt's pension reforms mean for you? What if you fear you're going to be dragged into the 45p tax rate? Or, of course, the benefits we've explored to some detail. It's all after this. 9:30, breakfast with me, Nick Ferrari, here on LBC News Time. Thomas Watts.
The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has told Nick he's taken a step towards reducing the personal tax burden. But his shadow, Rachel Reeves, says the national insurance cut doesn't remotely compensate for changes made over the last 5 years. The average household energy bill will rise by £94 a year from January. Ofgem, the energy regulator, is raising its price cap in response to higher wholesale costs. A pause in fighting between Israel and Hamas has been delayed until at least tomorrow. The agreement, including the release of around 50 hostages held in Gaza, had been due to take effect earlier this morning. LBC weather, cloudy with patchy rain for many and some blustery showers further north, a high of 13 degrees.
To nothing.
And it's time to revise Ask the Experts, or your questions answered in the light of the autumn statement. Let me briefly introduce the two panel. The first panelist, the second panelist who's going to be taking your questions before we come to the first of your calls. Paul Lewis needs virtually no introduction. Financial journalist, broadcaster, of course, long-standing friend to this show. Written Money Box, appropriate enough. Your toolkit for balancing your budget, growing your bank balance, and living a better financial life. Paul Lewis, in a sentence, a brief reaction to what you heard yesterday afternoon in the House of Commons. Morning, Governor.
Hello, Nick. I think it was what Jeremy Hunt didn't say, really. He didn't refer to this tax freeze. I mean, we heard it in the news bulletin just a minute ago. Personal allowance is the amount you can have before you pay tax has been frozen. This is costing all of us billions and billions of pounds every year. The national insurance cuts were good. They will result in lower taxes from January for people in work or under pension age. And I think the tax cuts for businesses were good because they will encourage investment. How much there will actually be, of course, we'll have to wait and see. And it was very good news that benefits are going up with inflation, and the state pension is going up as it should with earnings. And there were important changes to the amount of rent people will get help with when they're on benefits, improvements to that. So there were some good things, but overall, what is blanketing down on all our finances is this tax freeze. More of us paying basic rate tax, more of us paying higher rate tax, and every time you get a pay rise, Jeremy helps himself to quite a chunk of it.
All right, Paul, stand by, get your not that you need one, I was going to say get your calculator out. You don't need one, Paul. You do it all in your head.
I do.
You don't.
Full of calculators.
I've watched you in action. My other panelist is Eddie Graham. Now, Eddie is Director of Advice Services at the anti-poverty charity Z2K. I fear you've probably been all too busy then in recent months and years. You specialise in benefits and welfare policy. A brief overview from you, Eddie, and thanks for coming to the studio. Morning to you, sir.
Thank you, Nick. A brief overview, as Paul has referred to, the increase in the local housing allowance will help people meet their rent costs. That's very welcome. The benefits have been uprated in line with inflation. Less positive is the talk about sanctions, conditionality, ending people's entitlement to universal credit, reform of the disability tests, which will push more and more disabled people into having to look for work and will immediately create a lot of anxiety, I think, and worry amongst sick and disabled people out there about what's going to happen to their benefits.
I think that's been reflected certainly on my show, and I'm sure many of my colleagues through the course of yesterday on LBC. Gentlemen, thank you. Here we go. First up, Donna in Aldershot. Donna, we spoke earlier briefly, and I think Eddie's had sight. We're going to come to Eddie first, but just remind listeners, we talked about this earlier. Good to have you in again, Donna.
Hiya, Nick. Yes, I just wanted to know what the Prime Minister expects me to do when I have a disabled father that has dementia, and myself, as Louise, I have fibromyalgia.
Yes. And Louise, you referenced as an earlier caller. Now, Eddie's already had sight of that. In a way, Donna, you helped me and the team prompt the idea of bringing these two great financial gurus in to help us. So I'm going to come straight to you, Eddie, because you've already reviewed this case.
Yes. Hello, Donna. From what I heard yesterday, you're in receipt of personal independence payment. And,
I am, yeah.
And I think you care for your father, who gets,
I do, yeah.
and he gets attendance allowance. Is that right?
No, he doesn't get anything. He gets his RAF pension, and he gets employment support allowance.
Okay, all right. Sorry. And do you claim carer's allowance for looking after him?
No, I was told that if I wanted PIP, then I'd have to come off carer's allowance.
Okay. Well, Donna, all the things that were announced yesterday by the Chancellor, none of those things are going to directly affect you. So there weren't any changes announced to personal independence payment yesterday. So just to put your mind at rest, there won't be any changes. Are you claiming universal credit or employment and support allowance yourself?
Yes, I'm on UC. My husband works full time.
Okay. I think it's very unlikely, Donna, that you personally will be affected by anything that happened yesterday. If you are caring for your father, there is a benefit called carer's allowance, which you might be able
Presumably, Eddie, that will be assessed though if you have other incomes coming in, is it?
Carer's allowance isn't means tested.
No, it's not.
You can't work full time, and it overlaps with other benefits like the state pension or incapacity benefit. But I think, Donna, it's probably worth getting some specialist advice yourself. But just to put your mind at rest, nothing that was announced yesterday, as far as I can tell, will directly affect you.
Well, Donna, that's good news, because when we spoke a couple of days ago, I know that was your major concern. So as Eddie says, you might want to triple check it, but I think you're probably in the clear. So thank you again for both your calls now, and indeed prompting the idea of doing this. Donna, thank you. To the next caller. Okay, gents, Anastasia is in Leeds. Your question, Anastasia, good morning.
Hello, I did actually listen to the autumn statement. I've got cerebral palsy, and my concern is I'm transferring. I'm right in the middle right now, transferring from ESA to universal credit and going through assessments and all the rest of it. Work capability assessment, the health form is taking ages. I really don't want this to spill over until the following year, and I've got less money, so that's causing real serious anxiety. So I haven't got a clue what to do.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, you've done the right thing. I'm going to start with Eddie again, but we've got Paul as well. But Eddie, I think again you might want to ask questions of Anastasia, because I'm going to start with this. Probably moves more to your area, doesn't it?
Yes, thanks, Nick. Anastasia, just if you're already on employment and support allowance and you're already on universal credit, or you're transferring to.
I'm transferring. I'm on universal credit right now, but the money's much less because the health capability element, or the component, as I like to call it, the two components are not there.
So you're not getting the work. Limited capability for work-related activity.
Exactly.
Okay. So you, again, and it's important, and for listeners out there who are worried, that most of what's was announced yesterday will not affect people who are already on the benefits, basically, who are already being assessed and paid as being sick and unfit for work. There's not going to be any immediate effect. They're generally talking about new claimants. Some of the changes will come in 2025. So if you're already in the system, like yourself, Anastasia, you don't need to worry straight away. You're perfectly right in that for many people, universal credit is less generous than the system it replaced, and that's really unfortunate, and that's something we try and campaign about at Z2K. But you're in the middle of the process, you're already in the system, it's not going to affect you.
Anastasia, again, you can take heart from that, and thank you for your call. Yasu is in Uxbridge. I think this one's coming your way, Paul. Yasu, go ahead. Good morning.
Morning.
Yes, your question, Yasu.
It's Yasser, sorry.
I'm sorry, I've been told, I do apologize, Yasser. I'm sorry, I've spelled here as Yasser. Go ahead, Yasser.
I was just wondering what the government's doing about housing, because I spoke to you earlier, a few months ago, about I just got evicted from my property last month.
Right.
I've got 3 stories in my wife. Next year's budget, I was hoping that we'll hear something about housing.
Right.
Building new homes, social housing. Not a single word was mentioned. All the government was doing, just try and make people happy with these tax cuts and this and that.
Right.
And not a single about housing. So what happens to people like us?
Okay, let's put this to Paul. Has covered a couple of budgets and autumn statements in his time, I'm going to be honest, so he's aware of the housing issue. Paul, this is one that's certainly not going to go away. I sense actually it could be quite big for this statement and quite big for the election next year. Paul Lewis.
Yes, I mean, housing wasn't mentioned. The only thing that was mentioned, as I said earlier, is this local housing allowance, which helps people on benefit pay some of their rent, and they will get higher help with their rent from April. But there was nothing actually about house building, about encouraging it, or indeed about helping people with mortgage payments. Now, yes, sir, in your particular case, you were evicted last month. Landlords have the right in England and Wales to evict people for no reason, and there is a bill going through Parliament that will change that, but it really has got bogged down rather, and it's not really clear if that right to stay in your home, if you don't do anything wrong, like, you don't pay your rent or you have mad parties every night, then they can evict you. If they want to sell it, they'll be able to evict you, but they can't evict you just because they want to if you've not done anything wrong. Now, that may change in the future, but the government has really, as they say, kicked it into the long grass in the distance, and I don't see it happening before the election. Not that would help you, yes, you've already been evicted. May I ask where you're living?
Well, the council, I used to live in Mitcham.
No, I think Paul means, are you living with
accommodation?
Relatives, or I believe it's called sofa surfing, or God forbid, the street? Where are you living, sir?
Temporary accommodation, but it was 35 miles from where I used to live, which was impossible for me to take my kids to school and for work.
I see.
I had to push them. Only last night they changed me back to like a bit local to where I used to live, thankfully. Okay. I do thank them for that. It's just ridiculous. I've been changed in 2 months already, twice in 1 month already.
I think this comes to things that are separate from housing, really, that weren't in the budget either, Yasser. The Chancellor had a choice of using this extra money he sort of has floating around, in theory anyway, to cut taxes, which he did with national insurance and for businesses, or to improve public services. Now, you're suffering from the fact that local authorities, I think almost half of them are in real financial difficulties in England anyway. They can't really afford to fulfil their duties to homeless people like you. And, of course, you're suffering from lack of public transport, which again is something that wasn't mentioned in the budget. So there were a whole number of gaps in there, and certainly when I talk to people, they say we want life to be better, not necessarily have a few extra quid in our wage packet. So I really think you are suffering from neglect, I would say, yes, of people in your position, and there's hundreds of thousands of them.
Yes,
I'm sorry
to
paint such a bleak.
Paul, I'm going to stay with you for the next question. This is via email. It's from, I think it's Panch, P-A-N-C-H. I'm going to say Panch, or Panche perhaps. My mortgage from January is going up £400 a month. My tax cut is going to be £450 per year. Can an expert tell me, where am I going to do better? Are there mortgage products out there I should be looking at? This is one for you, Paul.
Well, there are some mortgage products that you might be able to do better. I don't know what circumstances you've got at the moment, of course, Pans, but I would say go to a good independent mortgage broker who looks at the whole of the country, see what they can find for you and see if it's worth switching. But it may be that because of your credit status or the size of the mortgage you've got, you won't be able to find a better deal. And, mortgage rates have gone up. They've gone up to probably, I'm sorry to say it, where they should be now. Now, it's very expensive and very difficult for people. And as you say, the tax cut will be the same per year as your mortgage has gone up per month. So all you can do is find a good broker and look for a better deal. But I can't promise you there'll be one out there. There may not be.
More calls to our panel. Eddie Graham, Paul Lewis in just a moment. 9:45, we need the LBC News headlines. Thomas Watts.
Official figures released this morning show net migration in the year ending June was 672,000 compared to 607,000 a year earlier. The Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves has told Nick that people can't carry on with a rising tax burden. And Ofgem has confirmed its energy price cap will rise by £94 a year for a typical household from January. LBC weather cloudy with patchy rain for many, a high of 13 degrees.
LBC Travel, I'm Joanne Webb. There are delays of about an hour and a half on the M1 southbound to just before 16 at Daventry. It's because that lorry overturned earlier. There's a load of wood still across the motorway and 2 of the 4 lanes stay closed. In South Yorkshire on the M18, northbound delays to junction 4 at Westmoor. That's all down to an accident. At the Scottish borders, the A1 is closed in both directions at the Coldingham turn-off, and that's because a lorry has overturned. The A3 in Surrey remains closed southbound at the Hindhead Tunnel. In Essex, severe delays continue on the A12 northbound to junction 18 at Danbury, and the M25 very slow anti-clockwise to junction 14 at Heathrow. A car's broken down.
Coming up at 10 on LBC, James O'Brien.
I think it's close to likely that they're planning a general election in the spring. What do you think of that?
James O'Brien.
These are the people who are going to provide you with the best comment and analysis. One of them is Alistair Heath, who described the catastrophic autumn statement of Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss as the finest budget he'd ever seen in his life. He's still getting paid to offer up his thoughts on economic analysis, and you'll never guess in a million years who's sitting next to him on the front page of the Daily Telegraph today. Kwasi Kwarteng, the man who delivered the catastrophic autumn statement, almost immediately wiped £30 billion off our economy. Who better, you may wonder, to turn to for sage economic advice than a cheerleader and an architect of one of the most perilous moments in the fiscal history of these eyes? Just absolutely extraordinary. Ever I think I exaggerate how bonkers things have become, how broken Britain has become, to coin a phrase, I just turn to this newspaper, this former newspaper, and marvel at the depths of post-truth reporting that it now plumbs. So that's your sugar rush. Never mind the facts, feel the celebration. Jeremy Hunt sorted you right out. Biggest tax cut since the 80s. Tax burden is higher than it has ever been, but it's not quite as high as it might have been, so they're claiming that it's the biggest tax cut since the 1980s. And they are doing it in order to soften you up for a general election. And I don't want to have I don't want to have a specific phone in today. It's slightly thin ice, this. It doesn't always work. Oddly, you're a strange creature, you are. The more laser-like my focus is on a certain question, the better the calls are. You'd think, wouldn't you, that asking quite a vague and flabby question and then opening up the phone lines would be quite a good way of doing, but it's not, usually. And today we're going to provide an exception to that rule. I am going to ask you quite a vague and flabby question, but I am going to demand a very high caliber of contribution, so you are only allowed to ring in if you're clever. Okay, in the second hour, we're looking at reports that the less intelligent you are, the more likely you were to vote for Brexit. So I'm tempted possibly to insist in the second hour that you're only allowed to ring in if you're not clever. And we can examine what it was about you that made you more likely to vote for Brexit. It's not me that's saying this, it's not an opinion, it's counting. It's proper research science, isn't it? But what do we think, genuinely, what do we think about the prospect of an election? The sooner he goes for it, Ollie in Oxford writes, the more chance he has of still being the leader when it actually happens. And that's all. I want to dedicate today's programme to Brenda in Bristol. Do you remember Brenda in Bristol? I should have thought of this sooner and we could have got the clip ready. Brenda in Bristol, when greeted with the news that a general election had been called, I think by Boris Johnson or Theresa May or one of them, it's so hard to keep up, responded with the immortal words, something like, oh no, not another one. Oh no, not another one. I'm going to dedicate today's programme to Brenda in Bristol. There's not actually a clear case for dedicating it to her, because the election, when it's called, will be fairly close to the wire, as in fairly close to the last point at which it could be called. You're not looking at a 2019 scenario that came after 2017, much earlier than it needed to be, but Boris Johnson, for various reasons, keen to cement both his majority and his premiership. But for those of us who approach general elections with a curious mix of anticipation and dread, that's why today is the day that we remember Brenda in Bristol. And the question I have for you is this: what do you think the general election is going to be fought on? How do you think the general election is going to be fought? I've read some speculation today, I've read some analysis. The best for my money is probably, once again actually, Aditya Chakraborty in The Guardian. But and some of the people that are paid for their punditry are obviously worth their wages. Others work for the Daily Telegraph. But I'm interested in yours. I think you've got as much of a guess as anybody else. You've got as much of a insight. So what do we think? So first of all, I'm right, aren't I? They've got to be softening us up for a spring general election. 0345 6060 973. The bigger question: what do you think? How are they going to fight this election? And I've tried recently to tempt Tories, traditional Tories, onto the programme a little more than I usually do, because not only do I think you're probably the loneliest people in British politics at the moment, but I genuinely think you're the most interesting. You know, the Conservative Party of Amber Rudd, or David Gork, or Dominic Grieve, or even perhaps Ken Clarke. I mean, who are you? Who speaks for you? How do you think this iteration of the Tory party is going to fight the next general election? With a little parenthetical side order of, it is going to be in the spring, isn't it? I haven't looked at the odds yet. I don't know what the numbers are. So how are they going to fight it? 0345 6060 973. How plausible is it that they haven't actually got a leg to stand on? This is it now. This sugar rush of almost mythical tax cuts. That's it. I mean, if I were a Tory, if I was supportive of the current shower, I'd probably be panicking. But if I was motivated more by a deep-rooted and carefully cultivated fear of the Labour Party, I don't know where I'd be today. I don't know what I'd be looking at. Rachel Reeves does not sound profoundly dissimilar in some areas to Jeremy Hunt. I think she's come on in leaps and bounds lately as a communicator, as a politician. But what on earth are the Tories, after 13 years of leadership, with the country in the doldrums, how are they going to fight a general election? What are they going to fight it on? And I'll take as imaginative an answer to that question as you want, really. 0345 6060 973. And then, of course, if you want, you can channel a bit of Brenda in Bristol and just tell me straight what you think about the prospect of a general election within the next 6 months. It's 1016. The number you need, as always, is 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien.
19 minutes after 10. I'm fascinated by intelligence. Quite often people who tell me that they're not very bright are very bright, and people who think that they are very bright aren't very bright. So John describes himself as not so clever in this text, but actually he makes a brilliant point that I've missed. All the way from the Isle of Coll. He says, can I throw the small boats into the mix? They've got to have an election before the summer, when there will be an increase in small boats. I'm going to make another prediction. Khalid and Paul will be up first. There's a couple of phone lines free for you if you're quick. I'm going to make another prediction because the immigration figures are fascinating. They're huge, unprecedentedly large. There are a couple of anomalies, most obviously Hong Kong and Ukraine. But if you look at something as simple as the number of visas that are being issued for care workers, then you get an idea of why these numbers are so high and why talking about lowering them is a little bit disingenuous. So the right-wing newspapers weaponised immigration to get Brexit done. But when you've got Tories in power and it's on the Tories' watch that immigration is happening, the right-wing newspapers are in a bit of a bind because they kind of don't want the opposition to win. It's pretty clear that all of the newspapers that I've referred to this morning dedicated very much shoulders to the wheel now to help the Tories do as well as possible in the coming election, which means that they can't really be as vile on the immigration figure and the immigration issue as they were in the run-up to Brexit. So they wanted to get Brexit done, but keep the Tories in power. So you almost create the idea that immigration is a consequence of European Union membership. But we're not in the European Union anymore. And it's 600,000-700,000. I'll get you the exact numbers in a minute. So you can only lay that at the feet of the government, which is, of course, what your Faragist weirdos will do. From the lunatic fringe of the lunatic fringe of the lunatic fringe of British politics. They'll just go for the nativist race baiting. But the papers can't do that because they want the Tories to do well in an election. So I think you're going to see probably quite a muted response to immigration. Not like quiet, but less than it would be until Labour win the election. At which point all bets are off and it becomes once again a rancid rhetorical device for right-wing media and, of course, right-wing politicians who will just ask you to ignore the 14-year record of the Tories on this issue and focus instead upon what's happening under Labour. And when you see Geert Wilders getting the most votes in Austria, a politician who was rightly barred from coming into this country for his divisive and toxic rhetoric not that long ago, wouldn't be barred now, so Ed Braverman would probably have him round for tea. You get reminded that the worst possible scenario for societies is economic crisis and refugee crisis, or economic crisis and far-right politicians demonising foreigners. So be careful. 10:22 is the time. Khalid is in Edmonton. What is the election going to be about, Khalid?
Morning, James. I find myself actually disagreeing with you once, actually.
Fantastic.
Fantastic. A rare occurrence. I believe they're going to go winter next year, and I'll tell you why. So I think they want one more budget. I get the feeling
there might be a budget in February. That's one of the...
Maybe one more autumn statement. I think there'll be a big headline tax cut ahead of any election, with the battlegrounds being basically Tories. We're a low party. We're a low tax party. And Labour basically saying, well, you know, we're the party of public spending. I think public spending versus low tax is really where the grounds are lying. I think a lot of people are fed up with the NHS. You know, they're simply the doctors and nurses, the railway workers, the teachers. Our public services are at its knees, and I think that's really where the battleground will be like. Do you want the spending?
Dutch, Holland, not Austria. I don't know where I got that from. Sorry, Geert Wilders is in Holland, not in Austria. Carry on, Kelly.
Yeah, indeed, and I think a lot of people. The reason why they're frustrated with the Tories is not necessarily, you know, all the kind of wokeism and all the kind of cultural war that they're trying to stoke. It's really about the fact that people can't get a GP appointment. You know, the school. There was no spending. There was no real difference whether you had a Tory government or a Labour government, because Labour made that commitment because they wanted power after being in opposition for so long.
Do you think they'll do something similar? I mean,
I think they'll do something similar. If the Tories go on the ground of we are the party of low taxation, and this is what you get. Labour, you know, Keir Starmer's going to have to really think about, you know, doing something similar to get those floating voters on board. And what does that mean for our public services over the next few years?
It's quite chilling. I haven't heard anything in what you said that makes me understand why you think it will be in October rather than in May.
I think just traditionally, colder weather, Labour voters. I mean, you have to factor in also the fact that there's voter registration this year, this time round, isn't there? So,
but that's again not. I mean, I'm looking at the sugar rush. Not really delivered in the numbers yesterday, but certainly delivered on the front pages. And that sugar rush says to me sooner rather than later. So that's all.
Yeah, I think there's an extra sugar rush coming.
That would be in February. That would be in February. One of my very clever colleagues, Connor, who I turn to at 10 to 10 many mornings and canvass his opinions before passing them off on the programme as my own. He's very much of the view, I think even to the point perhaps of placing a small wager, very much of the view that it's going to be May. And Aditya Chakraborty writing in The Guardian, the bottom line from that autumn statement, prepare for a general election in the spring. And what is it going to be fought on? And Khalid makes a great point. We'll claim to be the party of saving money and giving it back to you, so that makes you the tax cut party. But quite how anyone can look at the state of the nation and think, I know what we need. We need less public spending, less spending on infrastructure, less spending on public services, less spending on... And then, of course, if you replace the conversation about the NHS or the police force with a conversation about mythical benefit scroungers, then you can pass it off, can't you? And then you can get away with it. Thank you, Khalid. Rachel's in... How do I pronounce that, Rachel? Skurla.
Skurla.
Where's it near?
It's between Hull and Beverley.
Fantastic. I love Beverley. My dad was on the Hull Daily Mail many, many moons ago. What made you pick up the phone this morning?
Well, I think I agree with you. I think there's a sugar rush, and I think it could even be as early as January, February, but probably May.
Yeah.
But the purpose of my call is with a little bit of context. I live with MS, and I've only in the recent years had to leave work because of living with MS.
Yes.
So, and I have social media, and I support on kind of known as a bit of a disability campaigner, I suppose, in the area.
Yes.
And I'm also a member of DPAC Sheffield,
right,
which is Disabled People Against Cuts. I 100% think it's the Tories particularly are fighting it on culture wars, and they've already started. From the point of view of benefits, I posted things yesterday on social media and came under full attack from the if you can post on social media you can work type people.
Yeah.
And it's just they're just winding up the press to just come after us. I sort of said the 2019 election was won on racism, and I still say that to a large degree. They've kind of gone off the asylum seeker part at the moment, but it will come back.
Yes.
And the same with trans people, and I'm so nervous of people like your far right politicians like Lee Anderson, and there's a queue of them now. They're sort of gathering speed, aren't they? And some of them, the red wall MPs, so to say, and they really scare me because of the things that they're allowed to say.
When we talk about culture wars, we talk about, I think, the idea of politicians not promising to make their supporters' lives better, but promising to make the lives of people they've persuaded their supporters to despise worse. So Labour then, under that reading, become the party that will be encouraging children to transition gender in kindergarten. They'll be the party handing out all our riches to refugees. They'll be the party that are allowing skivers and lead swingers to live lives of luxury sitting on their sofa while the rest of us go out and work. And if history has taught us anything, it's taught us that these claims don't have to be true to be effective. Why so pessimistic? Why not a little bit more optimism that the population is wising up to these tactics now? Regardless of your experiences on social media, most people know the difference between counting and a deliberately performative toxic opinion.
I would like to think so, but I think it's the I suppose it's like the situation with I know one of the television programmes spoke to pensioners last night who were all over the moon because they've got the triple law.
Yeah.
And I'm not taking that away from pensioners at all, but that's kind of to me, that's the target area. That's one of Tories' target areas, because in my history, it's pensioners that vote Tory.
Well, of course it is.
Predominantly. So they will aim it at the people that they think they can pull in. I'm not convinced about Labour.
No, fair
and I'm not convinced that they're going to be able to turn it. I don't think anybody's going to be able to turn it around, James, in the next 10 years anyway. I think it's going to take a very long time to turn around after what's happened with public services
and public finances. The Resolution Foundation have put out some figures that are absolutely stunning in the while we've been on air, looking at the impact on household income, disposable household income. And it paints this Parliament, the Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak period, which followed the Theresa May, Boris Johnson period. So you time a Parliament from a general election. So this is going back to December 2019. And it shows that there has never been a contraction in disposable income in the course of a Parliament before. So it is the first time in modern history that we will have seen quite such a big fall in living standards. And that contraction, according to these figures, according to this analysis, that will still be going on next year whenever the general election is called. So that adds actually to Rachel's pessimistic analysis. They can't actually fight it on the money, as Khalid argued, they were bound to. So if they're not going to fight it on living standards, they're going to fight it on blame. It's 10:32. Thomas Watts is here now with the headlines.
Revised figures show net migration to the UK last year was much higher than previously thought. Around 745,000 more people arrived in the country than left, a record high. The energy regulator Ofgem has confirmed its price cap will rise by nearly £100 a year from January. It says the change has been driven almost entirely by market instability linked to the ongoing war in Ukraine. The Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron has visited a kibbutz at the centre of the October the 7th attacks by Hamas. He's in Israel for talks and will also have meetings with Palestinian leaders on his visit to the region. LBC weather: cloudy with patchy rain for many, blustery showers further north, a high of 13 degrees.
This is LBC.
Well,
James O'Brien. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
10:36 is the time. Mike, pure attack is the only option, James. They've got so little to boast about. It will simply be, at least we're not Labour. And you can remember the adverts with the deliberately chilling prospects. Ewan agrees it'll be fought on slagging off the other side instead of on what they can offer. Anthony in Reigate says, I believe the next election should be fought in a boxing ring, James, as Keir Starmer will have the height advantage and Rishi Sunak will finally understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of punching down. It's a little literal there, Anthony. There'll be a smear campaign, another Anthony, not in Reigate. Continuous front pages, just like the Curry gate, and I think it will be fought on the whole idea of not changing parties and risking a whole host of changes, says Joe in Birmingham. Labour will represent the change and therefore the economy could tank. It'll be a better the devil you know sort of scenario, if that makes sense. It makes sense. I don't know that I agree. And Brandon keeps it simple. They're going to fix potholes, James. It will be the election of potholes, the pothole election. Tory voters, and that doesn't mean, that we're not mates, not friends, can't get on with each other. Tory voters looking at this and thinking, I know what we need to do. What on earth would you say? The net migration figures are in. It's even higher than was expected. It's up to 672,000 in the year to June. That is an increase of 65,000 from last year. These are the two highest ever figures on net migration. And remember that in 2016, everyone who voted to reduce migration knew exactly what they were voting for. It's very condescending to think otherwise. Typical metropolitan elite behaviour. Everyone knew exactly what they were voting for. So even though they said they were voting to reduce migration, they knew that in fact they were going to see increased. I mean, it's just bonkers, right? But how does it feed into the looming election? Paul is in Bellingham. Paul, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'm going to take issue with you on one thing. It was stupid people that voted for Brexit. It was politically ignorant people.
The cleverer, you have jumped the gun here. Because this is our next topic, and I can tell you now that among those Britons in the top 10% by a measure of cognitive performance, 73% voted Remain, and among those in the bottom 10%, only 40% did. So this is cognitive performance, not political indoctrination.
But I mean, it's things that people just don't, the misunderstanding of it.
No, this is the next topic. Stop talking about the 11 o'clock in the 10 o'clock hour.
All right, okay. But I'll tell you what, they'll do what they usually, they'll do what they always do.
Go on.
They will have a simple campaign, like along the lines of Get Brexit Done.
Yes.
The Labour Party will over-egg the pudding with their campaign, saying that they're going to do so much and confuse people. And the simple message will get the one across, and it will be probably, stop the scroungers, be hard on prisoners.
I forgot about the prisoners. No one feels sorry for the prisoners. We'll be fine.
That's what. Look up for more people.
Yes.
But
can they do this? Hang on a minute.
Hang on. On the can, I've got a very important point to make.
Go on, then.
Remember.
Hang on, wait there. Everyone be quiet. Everyone be quiet. Paul's got a very important point to make.
Right. Remember, in the realms of psephology, to overturn a majority of 65 would be an exceptionally unusual event.
It's very true. It would be. I think we forget that a little, polls notwithstanding. Here's the thing that I find interesting, because your analysis, surely, with every passing year, the appeal to the old tricks that you describe loses its salience, because you can point at all of these things and claim that they're awful, but apart from possibly the bottom 10% of the cognitive performance population, you're going to say you've been in charge for 13 years, you've been in charge for 14 years. I mean, you might, let's even pretend you're right and the country has been crippled by people pretending to have long COVID or whatever it is, or prisoners. You have been in charge for 14 years. How can it possibly not be your fault?
They'll blame it on COVID. How could that be our fault? They'll blame it on Putin. And they'll say, look, the state of the country is not down to us, it's down to these unique events. And of course, they'll blame it, go back as far as when they took over and blame the Labour Party for the economic crash in the 2008, when they had to clean up the economy in 2008, which it wasn't. It was down to a bunch of merchant bankers.
Is that rhyming slang?
Well, right, exactly. Most appropriately.
It was mortgages, like subprime mortgages in America. It certainly wasn't the fault of Gordon Brown, which people like Greg Watts' chops are still pretending now.
They still blame the Labour Party for that. But it was down to
but look at the poll. The people don't buy it. So here's the only thing that we can disagree on. You're probably right that they're going to do it. I think we disagree on how effective it would be, because I suffer. I suffer from being one of nature's eternal optimists, Paul.
I'm actually a door knocker. I'm a Labour Party member. I'm a door knocker. I go out campaigning for the Labour Party. But
blimey, that's the definition of optimism.
But I'm telling you, that you have to change it with reality.
And do they say this to you on the doorstep? Do you deal with people who will be enraged very deliberately and consciously enraged?
What I'm dealing with a lot on the doorstep are people that are totally switched off from politics.
Yes.
Saying I can't be bothered to vote. Which is what they want as well.
Of course it is,
14% of the possible electorate voted Tory. So we've got 14% of the electorate getting a 65 seat majority.
It was 80 at the time.
Right, we've got it's a sickening state of to call ourselves a democratic country is a joke.
Well, I generally steer people away from the first past the post conversation, but I'm a bit frightened of you, so I'm not going to stick it.
It's now Labour Party policy. It was passed at conference last year that we should have proportional representation. We must save this country.
But then you could end up with Geert Wilders being the leader of the biggest party, and the British Geert Wilders, Nigel Wilders.
That won't happen.
You
not in this country.
I love you, mate, because you've just don't give me the analysis of what we would describe perhaps as the unthinking rump of the electorate having far too much power, and then in the space of a single phone call you've rejected the idea that having the unthinking rump of the electorate under a proportional representation system would actually deliver a far right majority or a far right biggest party.
They would never do that.
That's me thinking I was the optimist.
A good 60% of the British electorate are sensible people, and if I had my way, I would have the Australian system as well, where voting or attendance at a polling booth is mandatory.
Yes, I quite like that as well, and it would address some of the problems you described. What an amazing call, thank you, Paul. It would address some of the problems you described, which we'd file under lethargy. You can you can provoke political engagement. You can't force it or guarantee it, but just by definition, knowing that you have to vote would probably change the attitude slightly of someone, just recalibrate slightly the attitude of someone encountered on the doorsteps in Bellingham by Paul, who just says, oh, they're all as bad as each other, I can't be bothered. It's coming up to 10:45. How is it going to be fought? If I had to draw a rough consensus from the conversation that we've had thus far, it would be that they can't really go in on anything but so-called culture wars, with also probably inflated nonsense about the economy and legacy claims that Labour can't be trusted, all of which is polling appallingly for the Tories at the moment. It's a very interesting period of British politics. I don't want to be that guy who starts the show with a confident analysis of the political environment environment, landscape, and then ends the same hour with a retraction of the confidence that he displayed at the beginning. Quite a few people are pointing out the Resolution Foundation's analysis of where the governing party currently sits at the point of calling an election, and it is true that there has never been an election called early when the governing party is behind in the polls. 1992, just a tad, perhaps, early, but so that we're back to the Mr. McCorber analysis, which is if we're behind in the polls, why would you call an election? Because something could come up, something will come up, things could get better. In fact, one might quote D. Ream at this point, those great sages of political analysis, featuring Brian Cox on keyboards. D. Ream famously opined things can only get better. But that's not true. That's what I think that the people who are poo-pooing the predictions of a spring election are missing. If you were Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, how much faith would you put in the prospect that things can only get better? Because things can get worse. Things can get worse. The immigration figures have come out the day after the autumn statement, so by definition, the Tory party is in a weaker position today than it was yesterday. Things have got worse, not better. The prospect of small boats in the summer being weaponised by people even further to the right than Suella Braverman returns come the summer, after the spring. I'm going to stick to my belief that they'll go in spring, because the historical tradition of never going early when you're so far behind misses the broader ebb and flow of political cycles. This is an exhausted parliament. This is an exhausted government. Think of how many leaders you've had since 2016. You've had David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss. 5. You've had 5 different prime ministers. How many years back would you have to go for the previous 5? So if you take Cameron as 1, and May as 2, Johnson as 3, Truss as 4, Sunak as 5, then going backwards, you take Brown as 1, Blair as 2, Major as 3, Thatcher as 4. You're going back to Jimmy bloody Callaghan, aren't you? That's the 5. So 5 for 5. That's how chaotic everything is. So in that context, I don't think that the historical precedent arguments are as powerful as they would be in normal contexts. Luckily, there is a book available now in all good bookshops called How They Broke Britain by James O'Brien, and that demonstrates that it is perhaps wrong now to bring analyses based upon history and tradition and, crucially, on precedent into the uniquely corrupted ecosystem in which we now find ourselves. And Graham in Hailsham is only half joking when he says maybe another Falklands War, because that 92 election there, which was called a little early, I beg your pardon, the 83 election, that was, the Falklands War was pivotal to Margaret Thatcher's success in that election. So, that event, and it sounds brutal in the context of life and death and bloody war, but something will come up. There's always the possibility that something will come up, but apart from that, I wouldn't be clinging to that, I don't think, if I was Rishi Sunak or Jeremy Hunt. Not in this context, not right now. But I could be wrong. 10:52 is the time. Enzo is in Leigh-on-Sea. Enzo, what would you like to say?
Good morning.
Hello.
Speaking of precedent, you just brought it up. I think in all these scenarios, or maybe say if Corbyn may, the better speaker wins pretty much, I think, every time. I think whoever comes across in a debate format, in a speech format, they normally have the upper hand over their opponent. I think so. I think May and Corbyn was a bit close, but I think obviously Johnson, like him or loathe him, he's an incredible speaker. I think Cameron versus
Cameron Miliband. Are you sure Cameron was better than Miliband?
Oh, yeah. I think so. I think he's a smoother operator, certainly versus Brown as well. Brown a little bit lackluster maybe.
This is a tragic analysis, because you're talking about style trumping substance at every turn, aren't you?
And I think in a debate format, if the Sunak decides to play dirty, I'm not sure he's a great speaker, but I think Starmer doesn't deal well with what is a woman, and then in that scenario, Starmer, who's obviously Mr. Careful, I think you have to pick an analysis when you ask something.
That's a ludicrous question to ending. Deciding who actually leads the country, but you're probably right. You know, but these
it might come down to that, which is obviously not great. But I think Sunak, if he does feel a little bit like harnessing the dark arts, can say something grimy, and I think, you know, what does Starmer say to that? Does he isolate? Which arm does he cut off?
And that will depend on how much of the agenda is set by right-wing media, and this is the great challenge, whether you're talking about Ed Miliband, Jeremy Corbyn or Keir Starmer. How much dancing will they do to the tune of institutions that are dedicated essentially to their destruction?
Yeah, maybe. I think that's probably, obviously they're all working within the framework of what everyone's talking about, but I think that Sunak probably, you know, could come across slightly more engaging than a Starmer.
I'm going to disagree with you. I'm going to disagree with you about that. I'm not going to say Starmer's better. I'm going to say that you can't put a cigarette paper between them. PMQs is very evenly balanced. And listen, I'm biased. I imagine I'm biased. I don't know how easy it is to be sure, but I find Sunak less and less impressive. I think that once petulance appears, once you get, I think petulance is like kryptonite for politicians. As soon as Corbyn's petulance appeared, it was impossible to cling on to the sort of messianic hopes that he inspired in some people. And Sunak's petulance has appeared now. He doesn't think that people they shouldn't be. Why are you questioning me? No one's ever questioned me before. I've never had to account for, I've never had to explain myself. And there is a public school petulance there, which is built upon an idea that you never have to explain yourself. So I don't think, I mean, if you're right about what decides elections, I'm not sure that it is actually that bad a news for Keir Starmer. Slow and steady wins the race.
Sunak will be more comfortable with saying things that are absolutely explosive.
Yeah, or at least hiding behind the people who are saying it. And we've seen that with the promotion of 30p Leenock to Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party, despite routinely coming out with things that would have turned Margaret Thatcher's hair white in their obnoxiousness, while simultaneously delighting the Powellites. Enzo, thank you. I'm cracking on just so we can squeeze in one or two more calls. With Grant Shapps in charge of defence, says this texter, I'm not sure they'd want another Falklands. Good God, you have to laugh, because the alternative is to claw your own eyes out in despair. Mark's in Mill Hill. Mark, what do you think?
Very quickly, I think we're ignoring one point, which is that Brexit Part 957 actually kicks off on the 31st of January 2024 with new import controls.
Yeah.
So
these are the ones that Jacob Rees-Mogg described as an act of self-harm when he was postponing them previously.
And you will want to get an election out of the way before that becomes an economic millstone around your neck.
That's really interesting.
And I would think, if I were the Conservatives and I was Machiavellian, I would go the Thursday before Easter, 28th of March. And I would do that for any number of reasons, not least of which is the fact that the student vote will be out of position. It won't be where it expects to be.
And they will be gaming stuff like this. What do you think it would be? So you know the rationale of getting in there before the latest. And similarly, if you are like me, a frustrated former Remainer who doesn't quite know how to process all of the evidence now that we were right about pretty much everything, except what did Farage say in the jungle the other night? Standing on our own 2 feet or something. Yeah, there you go. That's worth all the damage, all the harm. At least you got what you wanted on immigration. Oh no, sorry. So you've got. I don't think there's much Schadenfreude to be had in this. And in fact, if there's a danger of anything, there's a danger of it feeding into that false perception of smugness and condescension that is often laid at the feet of former Remainers. Dominic Raab was very good at that before his career exploded in a fireball of bullying allegations and weapons-grade incompetence. Dominic Raab used to say, people like James O'Brien think that all Leave voters are racist and thick, which is not true. I don't think that all Leave voters, I never did think. My catchphrase was always contempt for the con men, like Raab, and compassion for the conned, as in the people who thought that they were going to be better off living in a country with a better NHS and lower immigration. How's that working out for you? Who really thought you were stupid? The people who persuaded you to vote for something impossible, or the people who tried to explain to you why the thing that you were voting for was impossible? Who thought you were stupid? The people who thought that, yeah, exactly. So James suggests the phone-in topic we're looking for is your spouse a dummy? 03456060973. I told you the morning before the referendum that if you were confused about what to do, then just ask the cleverest person you know. And I realised on the way home that certainly one of the cleverest people I know was definitely going to vote Leave, because he's the son of one of the most prominent and Eurosceptic politicians of the last 50 years, and he happens to be one of my closest friends. So even my little theory of asking the cleverest person you know what they're going to do and then do it, what I should have done is ask the stupidest person you know what they're going to do and then do the opposite. Would that have worked? If you'd asked the stupidest person, I'm just trying to think about the presenting lineup at LBC at the time. If I'd asked the stupidest person on the presenting roster at LBC how they were going to vote in the referendum and then done the opposite, how would I have ended up voting? Leave or Remain? Probably Remain, I think, don't you? I mean, you know, the world has turned a lot since then. We've got quite a different roster, different personnel, but that might have worked instead of telling you to ask the clever. But then we come back to the fact that the Remain voting partner was more likely to do better on cognitive tests. So why? This is not. I like this, David. I voted to Remain and my wife voted to Leave. She's far brighter than me, but she followed her Daily Mail reading parents, and sadly they are no longer with us. Again, I've got no beef with her, David. I'm sure you haven't either. Just the idea that you grow up, your parents, you trust your parents, they tell you that something is true, you believe that it's true, and then they prove it by showing you their newspaper, and therefore you vote to become the first population in history to impose economic sanctions on itself because you have been persuaded that it would somehow be a good idea. 10 minutes after 11 is the time. I want you to talk to me about why. That's all. So you can't argue with the statistics, you can't argue with the findings, but you can argue about why this might be. Well, why would it have been more appealing to somebody a bit slower intellectually? Why? Because it doesn't necessarily follow, does it? Why would it be the case that the cleverer you are, the less likely you were to vote Brexit? Just why? And I don't actually want. I think that the temptation to use this as a camouflage for some unpleasantness or some teasing, mild bullying, I think I would have probably found that hard to resist in 2017. But it's a bit pointless now, isn't it? I mean, I'm very much of the view that we've all lost now. We can see that everybody lost in 2016. Nobody won anything. And that's from a patriotic perspective, that's a national tragedy. That's a national tragedy. But the questions of how it happened remain interesting, particularly when you couch it in that language of becoming the first population in history to actually vote to impose economic sanctions on itself. It is something that many people in many other countries around the world find absolutely impossible to process. How could you possibly have become and you need to understand all sorts of things. You need to understand the right-wing media. You need to understand the sulphurous appeal of rhetoric like Nigel Farage's, the demonisation of all foreigners, not just recent arrivals in these lands. You need to understand the desperation of David Cameron. You need to understand the failure of the opposition parties, particularly the Labour Party, to offer up meaningful resistance, and the failure of both major leaders of the Conservative and the Labour Party in 2016 to campaign effectively and or together for the national interest. There are a million reasons why it happened, and this is perhaps just one of them. 3,183 couples, including 463 heterosexual married couples who had voted in different ways. And the conclusion of the research is that if you are cleverer, then you are more likely to have voted to Remain. And if you are less clever, if you are less intelligent, it's the headline in the Times, less intelligent, more likely to back Brexit. And I want to know why you think that might be, because you can't prove causation, you can only prove correlation. So why do you think that might be? And I'm not being facetious actually or disingenuous when I say don't be mean, all right? And if you can talk to me from the perspective of a couple, you're a member of a couple that voted differently, how do you greet this report? So you voted Remain and your husband voted Leave. The statistics suggest that means he's not as clever as you. How do you greet this report? 0345 60 60973. And of course the other way around, you voted to Leave and your husband voted to Remain. How do you greet the news today that you are probably less intelligent than him? And why do you think there appears to be a relationship between intelligence, or rather lack of intelligence, and support for Brexit? 0345 60 60973 is the number you need. It is, well, it's an arresting headline, but it's actually not a very happy one, regardless of how you feel about Brexit. This headline is, well, less intelligent were more likely to back Brexit. It doesn't help anything, really, does it? But it does beg a rather big and important question. Why might that be? Andy in Hampton Court points out that Ricky Gervais knew this a while ago without needing a university study. He suggested that in terms of asking the public to decide on important things, the fact that we had to take the do not drink warning off bottles of bleach was pertinent. Wait a couple of years and then have a referendum. Brian's in Cheshire. Brian, what do you think's going on here?
Well, it was, they made it a binary decision, but it wasn't a binary decision. It wasn't a yes or no. For instance, I was never going to be in favour of joining the euro in the state of our economy. I think Blair's sort of...
No one was ever talking about that.
No, exactly. I mean, it was all about immigration. And actually, there was a little bit of an error, I think, in inverted commas, free movement of people because there was free movement of capital. The point is, I think a lot of these were nuanced decisions. And if you're intelligent, you're probably more likely to understand that. And if you're not, I think if you ask the average person about the single market, I think they asked Boris Johnson about the single market, and he didn't understand what the hell it was.
Nadine Dorries had to ask her WhatsApp mate what the customs union was because she kept losing arguments about why it was important to leave it.
Yeah, and also it was.
But most people who voted Remain would have struggled to tell you exactly certainly what the difference between the single market and the customs union was. Yeah. But they would have understood frictionless trade was in place, and it was unlikely to persist afterwards, probably.
Yeah, I think a lot of people did understand that that if that Thatcher had been a big supporter of the single market. And
but this is knowledge, mate. This is knowledge, not intelligence. I think we're confusing knowledge with intelligence.
Well, I think people have made, almost like if you've gathered knowledge, then that helps you with your intelligence.
Well,
and if you're intelligent,
true.
you gather knowledge, don't you? What have you? It's the flip side of the same coin. That if people just go home, watch the soaps, go to work, there's nothing wrong with that. But then if you ask them to make a very complicated political economic decision, you might fall a little bit short.
And this is where Dominic Cummings' deployment of Facebook in the final weekend becomes really pertinent, because sending messages to your Auntie Doris telling her that if she votes Leave she can have a new hip. It's just very simple.
£350 million a week, a very simple but stupid and idiotic sort of thing, and people who aren't that bothered about politics, not bothered about it's self-selection, me phoning you today. They're going to vote on very simple things.
Could the Remain campaign have capitalised on it from the other angle? Could they have offered up more atavistic rallying points?
Why didn't they just say, look, if you work in this company, your job will be at risk?
Project Fear, though.
Sorry?
Project Fear, mate.
So again?
Project Fear.
Yeah, well, I think, unfortunately, at that atavistic level, that's what works.
So every time I point out something, or even if I try and appeal to your baser instincts by making you feel threatened by the prospect of leaving, the people on the other side just shout Project Fear a bit louder.
Well, okay, but then So it was easier, overall, it was easier to do the Johnny Foreigner bit, which was a very large element of it, and is always a large element of it when you're making decisions like that. If you want it to go in a sort of nationalistic...
and do you think cognitive function comes into that? Because there's plenty of very well-educated racists out there.
Yeah, but I think on average, and we're talking about average, we're not saying that every person who voted Leave was an idiot.
No, quite the
every person who voted Remain was a professor.
No, that's categorically not the case.
We're sort of saying that on balance, most people who probably made more of a nuanced decision to stay in than to leave. And actually a lot of people might have done it. Remainers might have gone, well, I know that I can walk through the passport.
And better the devil you know. So also, your relationship with change, which has nothing to do with your cognitive function. Martin Lewis explained this brilliantly. A risk he talked about rather necessarily than change. But, you know, a lot of it will be informed by how comfortable you are with risk, because it's a bigger risk to leave than it is to remain. But that could have been, of course, informed by satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the status quo. So the less you felt you had to lose, the more tempted you would be to take a risk. And I don't think that's got anything to do with cognitive function, which is why I stress, and I will continue to stress, that this is fascinating, but it is not a cause for either celebration or commiseration. As the man behind the research said, people should not get angry with this or joyful, depending on who they voted for. Although Dougie adds, I'm listening to this with an incredulous look on my face, wondering whether anyone really needed a university-backed study to figure out the bleeding obvious. Listen, the thing about academia is the quality of the research, the questions that are asked, and the way that the research is conducted. So there's something, Dougie, there's something unhelpful. I'm sounding like a teacher now. I want you to have a good, long, hard think about yourself, Dougie, because if they do some qualitative research, they do some good research, and the conclusion of that research tallies with what you expected the conclusion to be, it doesn't make the research a waste of time. In many ways, it becomes the polar opposite. It's trying to make sense of things that are true, not just to discover things that are true. So there's a little bit in the new book about a researcher at the University of Warwick, actually, looking at the impact of austerity on the likelihood of someone changing their voting intentions towards UKIP. And the harder they were hit by austerity, the more likely they were to consider voting for UKIP. So not only does that portray David Cameron as being a secret weapon of the Leave campaign, but it also walks the tightrope between causation and correlation, because you can't categorically prove that the reason they were more drawn towards UKIP was because they'd been hit harder by austerity, but there's a very strong sense that it probably played a part, and that research might tally with what you thought was the case. You might have thought it was bleeding obvious that austerity drove the Leave vote, because, as I said a minute ago, the less you've got to lose, the more likely you are to take a risk or to vote for a change without even knowing what it was. So you might think it's obvious, but someone taking the time to ask the right questions of a representative portion of the population, coming back with conclusions that are intriguing and interesting, that doesn't make the research... Sorry, Dougie, you weren't expecting the Spanish Inquisition, were you? But I just, you know, it got on my nerves slightly when a colleague picked up on this research and pointed out how interesting it was. And some people responded by saying, oh, bloody centrists. Oh, they're so surprised by it. And you're not surprised by the conclusion of the research. You're impressed by the quality of the research. So that's a really good example of people who think they're clever actually being too thick to understand what's going on in a conversation that they're criticising. And I know you weren't doing that, Dougie, but just because the conclusion comes out in agreement with what you expected doesn't in any way undermine the importance and the validity of the research that delivered the conclusion. It's 11:25. Joe's in Bath. Joe, what would you like to say?
Hello, my name's actually Larissa.
Oh. Why did you tell the producer it was Joe?
I didn't. I told him that the last time I rang and I needed to ring anonymously, I gave a different name. And I just said to him, my name isn't Joe, it's actually Larissa, because I want my name.
It's all right. There's a glitch on the computer. They couldn't change your name from the time you rang in when you pretended to be somebody else.
It doesn't matter. That's quite all right. Anyway, the point is...
Yes.
Rather like you, the most intelligent person I know voted to leave.
Yes. I didn't say he was the most intelligent. I just said he was one of my cleverest friends.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the most intelligent person I know, who actually won
the Mystery Hour board game on your programme a few weeks ago.
So that's a high mark of intelligence. I think we can all agree.
Exactly. She voted to leave, and she voted to leave because she was very concerned about the bubbling up of the far right across Europe.
Yes.
And today's election results in the Netherlands is a good indicator of the sort of thing she was concerned about.
Well, yeah, but so is Suella Braverman being Home Secretary until last week. So I don't know that it necessarily makes a vote to leave the European Union the right thing to have done in retrospect.
But that was her...
No, that's fine. But that's not... We're not relitigating Brexit. We're looking at why there might be a relationship between intelligence and vote and Brexit vote.
What concerns me about this research... I see on social media regularly statements like, these people are so stupid they shouldn't have the vote. And what worries me about research like this, as well intended as it might be, is that it begins to pave the way for introducing new bars to the franchise.
I don't think it does, but I understand your concern, because you've got people on the other side saying, if you love the EU so much, why don't you move there? To which you respond by saying, God, you really are stupid. You abolished my freedom of movement.
Yeah. But this concerns me. There is a kind of a feeling in the kind of lay political discourse that there should be some sort of cognitive bar or cognitive level that you have to pass in order to be able to have the vote. Now, I read something very interesting, or I heard it on a podcast recently, but one of the reasons in the early 20th century for the massive investment in adult education in Britain was that British governments were very concerned about the rise of populist politicians in Europe. You know, they saw what was happening, and they recognised that educating the electorate gave the electorate the capacity for critical thinking and for making their own judgments and their own decisions about who was presented to them to vote for. So there is really interesting stuff here around intelligence and the franchise.
Yes, there is. And you're right, there is a sort of sense of flirtation with eugenics almost here.
Exactly.
Yes.
Because it really frightens me.
But I know we can trust each other. I think we're conducting the conversation in a suitably responsible way.
Yeah. I just really worry that this idea that there need to be more barriers to voting.
Yes.
That concerns me.
No, and I understand why, although I'm certainly not suggesting that for a minute, and neither is the research, the study called Understanding Society, which is what the research, the name of the study in which this research has been published at the University of Bath. But you make a very, very valid point, and, you know, I don't know what the word for that is, really. I don't like the word eugenics, but the idea that you would have some form of intelligence test before people were allowed to cast a vote would be a profound undermining of democracy. And don't forget, and Larissa will appreciate this, but I sometimes need to remind myself, progress is still relatively recent. You know, extending the franchise to women, extending the franchise to the working class. These are wins. These are not inevitable evolutions of society. These are wins by the kind of people who at that time would have been demonized like Just Stop Oil protesters are demonized now. These are hard-won battles undertaken by people determined to break the status quo. And so they can go back again. So yes, the preciousness of the vote must overshadow any conversations or research about the relationship between intelligence and deciding how to cast it. 11:30 is the time, Thomas. It's 11:34, Mystery Hour on the way at 12. Before that, we'll catch up with events this week, or certainly in the last couple of days, at the COVID inquiry. I think there's one interesting element, well, there's several interesting elements of it, but Sunak's claims that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme was scientifically cleared with the scientists, discussed even with the scientists, seems to have fallen apart. Again, you know, if we lived in a normal country, then that would be quite a big deal. And for the current Prime Minister to have potentially misled the population about the scientific advice that he had taken before deciding to get us all into Nando's in the middle of a global pandemic. But we don't live in a normal country, so we'll have to wait and see what happens with that story. We'll find out a little bit more about it later. What I really want to do is to speak to someone who voted to leave the European Union about why you think there is a relationship between intelligence or lack of intelligence and the vote that you cast. but I don't want to have a fight with you or make you feel bad. I hope that you don't feel, well, you feel a bit bad, really, because it's damaged all of us, but I don't have particular beef with you because of the effort that was put into persuading you to vote in the way that you did. I don't think I'm going to get coupled. Are you going to call me? If you're still together, I suppose if you've broken up, you might want to tell me what you think is going on here. But isn't it fascinating, of the 463 heterosexual married couples who voted different ways in the referendum, the Brexit voting half was on average the poorer cognitive performer. Why would that be? 03456060973. Why is that more interesting than the rest of the research? Because you're likely to be exposed to the same external stimuli and influences. If you're a married couple, you're more likely to be exposed to the same media as each other, for example, or you're party to the same conversations, you are accessing the same information and yet arriving at two very different conclusions on this kind of issue. I love it. I just find it really interesting. 11:36 is the time. Richard is in Woolwich. Richard, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James. James, I'd like to kind of just expand the idea of intelligence. So, of course, the study is about cognitive intelligence. I understand that, and that's IQ and the rest. But, of course, there is multiple intelligence. There's things like social intelligence, for example. And in all the studies I've done and the assessments, I have quite high social intelligence, and I voted to remain. And when I think about that, and I have a lot of friends who have high social intelligence who also voted to remain, and therefore I see the correlation more around saying that people who are really relaxed about multiple identities. So I'm really relaxed. I'm English, I'm British, I was European, I'm Commonwealth, and I'm really relaxed about that. And I'm also really relaxed about collective decision making. And I have no fear of it. So my understanding of everybody I know that voted to remain has high social intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's even helpful to call it social intelligence, actually, just from a point of view of making other people feel bad, even if it's technically accurate. I love the word relaxed, actually. I think that did more lifting than the social intelligence line. It's just I'm relaxed because probably the average Leave voter would find it a lot easier to admit to being unrelaxed about the things you've described than unintelligent.
I agree with you. There is, but it is curious. All the kind of the Brexiters I kind of knew, and some of them whom are we're no longer mates, as it were.
Really, you fell out over this, or?
Oh God, yeah.
It does happen.
And by the way, in all those, I used to live in Hungary, and in all those long years, you were the go-to person.
Thank you. Well, I hope you're not blaming me for the failure of your friendships.
No, I'm certainly not. But I just find it fascinating that this kind of sense of, as you say, being comfortable about having all this kind of multiple noise going on. For me, it's a really important factor here, as opposed to cognitive intelligence. And I felt, and with the Brexit, what I felt was this kind of, the relationship I had was this kind of entrenched, very hard, very dogmatic, very fearful view of otherness, which I didn't get in with my Remain friends who had high social intelligence.
Yes, I wonder how that applies to sort of spectator columnists who are clearly not stupid people, but who are supremely unrelaxed about the other issues you've described. You perhaps would posit that they might not have high social intelligence.
Well, I would posit that they're just trying to sell columns.
Well, there is that as well, but some of them seem to believe it. It's always hard to tell which ones. But yeah, so the distinctions of different types of intelligence, I suppose, work. But none of this is very comfortable listening for people who voted to leave, albeit that these are averages. And as I stressed from the beginning, I know certainly intelligent, highly intelligent people who also, for the record, I would describe as socially intelligent as well, supremely relaxed about. In fact, one of my Leave voting friends lives in the Canary Islands. But yeah, it's a long story. But yeah, it remains uncomfortable listening. The temptation to assume an association between measures of cognitive ability and the way people voted is going to be very high for frustrated Remainers. And is there any other kind of former Remainer than the frustrated kind? Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the kind words. Adam's in Nottingham. Adam, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Good to speak to you again. I voted Remain. I think we've spoken about it a number of times. So that's what I think. I have an overall sort of a bad feeling about sort of trying to link intelligence with Brexiters. And the ultimate thing is really, I think you nailed it earlier, and it was really around causation and correlation. And one of the things which I've always sort of looked at since the Brexit vote were almost, shall we sort of say, the demographics. So ultimately, the primary demographic was age.
Yeah, but they played that. They've done that. They took into account factors such as income, education, and age.
But the ultimate thing is, I'm still. This is where my ultimate beef is. Sometimes there is, if you imagine a Venn diagram, we're looking at things such as sort of two separate sets. So age and education. However, if we sort of look at the changes in the UK over maybe the last sort of 20, 30 years, particularly when it came to higher education, in particularly the number of people who have been university educated, between the 20 and 40s, it's far higher than in terms of a population from, say, 55 to 65s. Alternatively, those who left at 16 or 18.
You're not wrong in what you're saying, but you are wrong in what you're reading into it, because this research categorically adjusted for age and for education. So, even taking into account those factors, the conclusion is that the lower cognitive function is allied with a higher likelihood to vote Brexit. Even with the things you've described. So I think, like you, I want to believe that because it's brutal, right? This conclusion, if you're going to marry it, and of course it involves making that leap from correlation to causation, but it's hard not to, because I can't think what else the explanation would be.
Yeah, well,
you're a nice man. You're a nice man, and you're trying to give a break to people who voted to make us all poorer.
Well, yeah, I find that totally unforgivable.
And to abolish our freedom. That's the problem with us bloody Remainers, is we're too nice. Yeah. So here's some chummo over there who abolished your freedom of movement, took away your economic prosperity, turned you into the first population in history to impose sanctions on itself, and here's you and me trying to say, oh, don't feel too bad about yourself, I'm sure you're not stupid.
Yeah, as I say, I can't.
That's the curse of the Remainer, you see? And then he'll accuse you of thinking that he's racist. You can't win. Welcome to my world.
You can't.
You can't. Thank you, Adam. Always a pleasure. James is in Bedford. James, what would you like to say?
I think it's not a little bit unfair to...
Profoundly unfair. Desperately unfair.
Yeah. Well, it's a little unfair, I think, to say that maybe Leavers weren't that intelligent. My member of the Leave versus Remain campaign, the Remain campaign was mainly focusing on facts and figures and numbers,
yes,
whereas Leave was really focusing on more of an emotive thing. Like, they were talking about independence, sovereignty, hope.
Not really. Not they did after they won, and everyone started asking them about the numbers and the facts and the costs of food coming down and the £350 million a week for the NHS. So only after they won, and people started asking them questions about the facts that they'd claimed, that they then started talking about the more nebulous things like sovereignty. I mean, even the Google search statistics on the word sovereignty are fascinating. So I challenge your memory on that one, James.
My memory might be a little bit damaged from a few years ago, to be fair.
Yes.
I remember Boris Johnson standing up on stage saying that, the campaign are talking about, or Dirge or whatever, and we're talking about hope, and I've seen Reform UK push that sort of thing on their socials.
Now, yes, but not before the referendum, oddly. Before the referendum, they were insisting on measurable improvements in our lives. Your life will be better if there are fewer immigrants. Your life will be better if we don't have to obey these laws. These laws are holding us back. Brussels is dedicated to the detriment of the United Kingdom. We must free ourselves from those shackles to be better off. And then it happened, and we said, when are we going to be better off? And they said, well, you're not, but you've got all that sovereignty. You've got all the sovereignty you can eat. You say, what sovereignty? So don't ask difficult questions.
Well, this kind of completely undermines the defence that I was going to try.
It's like the good old days. Well, yeah, well, it doesn't completely undermine it.
Yeah, I mean, basically the point I was going to try and make was that somebody who's kind of more interested in facts and figures and numbers might do better on an intelligence test.
Maybe.
So,
well, hang on, let's do it the other way around. I'll meet you in the middle and say that if you were of slightly lower cognitive function, then when you turn up to the person that sold you Brexit and say, when do I get the benefits? And they say, oh, you've already got them. It's all the sovereignty. You might be more likely to go, oh, okay, thank you very much.
I guess I can't really argue against that. Like I said, you kind of undermine my argument by pointing out, well, facts and memory.
Thank you, James. It's 11:46.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
To his evidence yesterday, he revealed shocking messages that were sent to his family. He said they were threatened with having their throats cut over his response to the pandemic. And he said it makes him really worried that that sort of treatment of public-facing figures during times of national emergencies will put people off wanting to do those vital roles in the future. And then in terms of the government's handling of the pandemic, the really key part of Sir Jonathan's evidence yesterday was about when he says he heard about Eat Out to Help Out, and his account tallies with Sir Patrick Valance's and Sir Chris Whitty's. He was asked by the counsel to the inquiry, Hugo Keith KC, whether he was consulted about the scheme.
Absolutely not. The first I heard about it was on the TV.
I think that indicates what view you would have taken had you been consulted.
Had I been consulted, I wouldn't have made any distinction between Eat Out to Help Out and any other epidemiological event that brought different households into close contact with each other for the purposes of socialising, eating and consuming alcohol. The net epidemiological effect is kind of agnostic to what's on the menu, as it were. But I would have said this is exactly encouraging what we've been trying to suppress and get on top of in the last few months. So it didn't feel sensible to me.
It didn't feel sensible to me. So that's Valance, Whitty and Van Tam. Sounds like an action movie. All adamant that they were not consulted on the Eat Out to Help Out scheme that Rishi Sunak launched.
Absolutely. That's 3 for 3.
Okay, well, this is very awkward then.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows, there is an ongoing statutory inquiry into COVID. It's absolutely right that that process is followed. I look forward to providing my own evidence in the coming weeks and addressing all these questions. But it was the case that the government took advice from scientific advisors, and again, that's exactly what this inquiry will go over.
Was that specific to Eat Out to Help Out? It was specifically asked about Eat Out to Help Out and specifically stated in the House of Commons that he had taken scientific advice, and yet the 3 key scientific advisors have all said in the space of this week, well, he didn't ask me, Gov.
And you start to get a picture of this kind of ripple of disbelief that spread among those experts as they heard about the scheme. They say, as it was announced, obviously Rishi Sunak says that they were consulted on it.
And Dame Angela McLean has been giving evidence as well. She, of course, I think is the one who gave Rishi Sunak the nickname Dr. Death, although we only found out about that relatively recently.
Yeah, so that came out in the last sitting that she did in the inquiry, and today she has been giving more evidence. So she called Rishi Sunak Dr. Death in a note that she sent during a crisis meeting that was convened to discuss Eat Out to Help Out. She sat on Sage during the pandemic, and today she hasn't been talking about that so much. She's been talking about the outbreak of COVID in care homes. She says that was foreseeable. She has criticised the speed of the decision making in government, saying it was the UK's most significant pandemic shortcoming. And she echoed Chris Whitty's comments earlier this week by saying she also thinks the first lockdown should have come sooner.
So if we're doing a with benefit of hindsight exercise here, I would say it should have been 2 weeks earlier. That would have made a really huge difference. Now, we didn't have the data 2 weeks earlier, so by the 16th we had enough data. In my opinion, we should have gone into lockdown. Given what we knew about how fast this epidemic was spreading, given what we knew and could surmise about the fact that there seemed that probably everybody could catch it. I mean, probably everybody was susceptible to catch it. I think there was enough information on that date to say we need to stop all non-essential contact.
Well, curiouser and curiouser. So I suppose somebody somewhere is going to have to ask Rishi Sunak which scientists it was that he took the advice from, because it wasn't any of the household name scientists who we have been hearing evidence from this week.
No, and who will appear in the coming weeks. Not next week, it's another blockbuster
Hancock's
week,
in
though.
next week, I think.
Matt Hancock, Dominic Raab, Michael Gove, they're all scheduled to give their evidence. And on Monday, it'll kick off with London Mayor Sadiq Khan and Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham.
Do you think, Helen, that there are some scientists, but they go to a different school?
We'll have to ask him in the inquiry. We'll wait and see what he says.
And I think we can probably rely on Hugo Keith to open that door. Helen Hoddinott, many thanks indeed. John in Bromley's been in touch in response to the conversation that we've been having about the apparent relationship between cognitive function and voting for Brexit. John writes, well, will that boring dope O'Brien ever stop going on about Brexit? He needs to shut up. From John in Bromley. And you've been in touch again to say, O'Brien comes on at 10, time to turn radio off and put CD on, wrote John in Bromley at 11:56, during a conversation about whether or not there might be a relationship between cognitive function and support for leaving the European Union. I'm not making any comments on that. I'm not reading anything. I'm not inferring anything from those details, but I'm telling you this, it's Thursday, it's nearly 12 noon, it is time for Mystery Hour, your weekly opportunity to achieve the sort of satisfaction not ordinarily available anywhere else on your radio dial. And guess what? This only holds true for about 43 seconds, but if you hit the numbers now, you will get through. And don't forget, there is even a board game to win, if you're lucky.